Hello, welcome to Unending History. This is episode 2 of our series on Afghanistan. I'm Owen. I'll be introducing the episode today. So today we're going to be talking about the process of state building in Afghanistan following the US-backed invasion in 2001. In particular, we'll be focusing on the period between 2001 and 2009, the first 8 years of the state building process in Afghanistan, during which many of the vital and formative decisions regarding how the state of Afghanistan would develop following 2001. We'll be looking at whether the US backed effort to build up state institutions in Afghanistan was a failure, and discuss, if it was a failure, why. I'm joined by Max, Noah, and Armin today.
Hello, I'm Max.
Hello, I'm Noah.
Hi, I'm Armand.
Shall I get us started with the first and I suppose central question to this entire episode really is, why did state building in Afghanistan fail? Now I'll just start us off with some context around state building in Afghanistan itself. So prior to 2001, Afghanistan had essentially been without a central government since really the late 70s, in the sense there was a single unified country due to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan to support the communist government against the Mujahideen. But so following 2001, success of the Northern Alliance and the US-backed coalition, they were able to establish a transitional government headed by Hamid Karzai, and then in 2002 saw the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, which is a government that would remain in place until 2021. And this was, ostensibly supposed to be a democratic government modelled on sort of Western concepts of liberal democracy. It's meant to be a representative democracy, inclusive of the various ethnicities and even religions of Afghanistan. This was to be supported by funding from the USA, its allies, various UN projects to help build up the institutions of state. And I suppose I should define what we mean by institutions of state. We're talking sort of the judiciary system, the parliamentary systems, the ability of the state to exert itself over Afghanistan. So this would include things like the police, the military, but also the ability to sort of build up schools, hospitals, essentially just the basic functionings of what is a government. So our first key question, as I say, is why did state building in Afghanistan fail? So, we've done some reading. I guess I'll go to you guys first and just ask you, why do you think state building failed? I'll start with Max. Do you have any
Sure.
thoughts?
Well, it does seem like right at the beginning, from the start of the effort, there was several problems. In particular, one problem that sticks out to me a lot, maybe just as an American in particular, is how little planning there had been from the Bush administration from the start to do any state building. At the beginning of the invasion, the Bush administration actively said they weren't going to do a state building effort, that they weren't there to do that they were there to, smash the Taliban, get the leaders of Al-Qaeda who were being allowed to train and practice inside the borders of Afghanistan by the Taliban. And it pretty quickly became apparent that they would have to do some state building, but they never really wanted to commit the necessary resources. So they didn't go in with a plan, and when they realized they had to make a plan, they constantly made plans that were really short increments. We're talking like 2-year increments. They would go in, okay, we've got this plan for 2 years, and then 2 years later they would change the plan because they realized that plan wasn't working, right? They weren't going to be able to build a state in Afghanistan for 2 years, so they had another couple-year plan. So the constant shifts, and that continued well past the Bush administration. There's constantly this mentality of, how can we leave Afghanistan as soon as possible? Which means there's just not a lot of organization from the United States, which is, it's not the only organization. The UN is involved, and a lot of European countries are involved as well, but the US is the number one factor. And there are other problems which people might bring up, but to me, I think that might be the biggest issue.
Yeah, I agree. I do think a lot of the planning was ad hoc, essentially, sort of
Right.
winging it.
And often put into the command of military, right? Like it was the military who was responsible for building up Afghan's military forces, right? We're like, oh, well, you know how to function, so go build up a military in Afghanistan. But, it's actually not the military in the U.S. that builds the military in the U.S. in a sense, right? Like that, it had to be built up by civic institutions.
Yes.
So there's just
And if I could, can I jump in really quickly on that?
Yeah. It always.
Well, yeah, and I think that's really reflective of how culturally America took their enterprise in Afghanistan. The fact that it was so military fronted showed, one, I think that the United States was not prepared for this kind of project, first of all, and I think they would defer a lot to the military for that reason.
right.
And secondly, I think they saw this as a situation in which they would rely on the military because of Afghanistan's status as a third world country.
Right.
Like, this is not how we would treat Germany, for example.
It also had the responsibility for state building was mainly given to the Department of Defense,
Right.
which is not equipped to engage in state building. That's
Right.
not what military.
Right.
And the
Militaries
US,
are
yeah,
poor.
the U.S. did, at first the U.S. wasn't even coordinating with the UN, for example, in doing state
Yeah.
building, right? They were going in, and the U.S. was like, well, we've made this, there's lots of talks in the literature about the U.S. being like, the unilateral, right? Whereas the UN style is always going to be multilateral. And there's just not a lot of patience on the American side, which leads to them making ad hoc decisions. I do think, one thing we need to address here is, okay, so obviously America did a lot wrong, but there's also, problems, let's say, endemic to Afghan history at play here, right?
Yeah, which is that Afghanistan, in the modern sense, has never really had a state per
Right.
se. Attempts with the communist government of the 60s and 70s, attempts with the kingdom of sort of the 50s and earlier, but never really becoming what we would define as a modern state, in that is one that has the monopoly on violence, which certainly I don't think any government in Afghanistan has ever been able to claim.
Right.
There have always been parts of the country that simply aren't under the control of government. Even the current Taliban government does not control all of Afghanistan. There are areas that are controlled by groups who oppose them, whether that be sort of remnants of the old Afghan government or ISIS affiliates.
Right.
They have not managed to do that either. You want to say something, Noah, by the way?
I think it's, in my mind at least, all of the half measures and lack of real planning by the military, in my mind, it makes me think that there never was a real effort, a good faith effort to state build. It feels like the military always expected the program to fail, and so never really set itself up for success in the first place.
And yeah, the U.S. government never really gave the State Department necessary resources as well, right? They preferred buying the Army, more planes to building up the State Department's ability to, advise the Afghan government. Do you think, though, Noah, that that's not just... Do you think it's one-sided or two-sided? That the sort of genuine effort to state build, right? What you called a good faith effort. Do you think that's also present on the Afghan side?
Do I think that
the Karzai government, say, gave a real, genuine effort to state build?
I don't know, and I think it may be it's kind of a chicken and the egg thing of you have. Even if they're not giving a good faith effort to state build on the Afghan side, is that a internal issue, or is it just a feedback loop from a non good faith U.S. effort? Why would you try to state build if your ally and the thing propping you up isn't really trying to state build?
I would say that, in my opinion, state building is almost impossible to do externally. The actual success of state building comes from building the resilience of institutions in their own right. And one of the big problems I think with the institutions of the Afghan government post 2001 was their dependency on the US.
Right.
So the obvious one is its military, which collapsed not long after the Americans left. You know, like many of their troops had abysmal morale and gave up, or just didn't actually exist in the first place. You know, they were ghost soldiers, so to
Yeah,
speak.
paper armies.
Yeah, but it goes much further than that. I mean, obviously, like the police and military are important in terms of, you know, coercion, which is one of the key elements of being a state, is your ability to coerce your own population. But also, you know, financially, the country was not independent really in any way. I mean, the country heavily relied on foreign aid, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but there are very few ways for the government of Afghanistan to extract its own revenue. There are lots of problems with tax collection. There are lots of problems with exports, in that Afghanistan doesn't really export that much, which we sort of covered a bit in the previous episode. There are a few avenues from which Afghanistan can produce revenue in its own right. Its banking system was very weak. It had a very poor credit rating, unsurprisingly. So it couldn't really borrow money, so it was almost totally reliant on foreign aid,
Right. So
which they have less control over the spending of.
right, because I think you're bringing up, or we're getting to a point here where we kind of have to ask: was it ever possible, at least? Because you've said you don't think that it's possible. It may not be possible to state build externally.
No, there has to be
So do we think
a
that?
significant degree
right.
of internal state building.
Do we think then that the U.S., let's say, you know, if the U.S. had gone in with a better plan, right, had created an agency focused on state building that was given lots of resources and effectively given resources, right? Because of course more resources doesn't mean effective, which is a huge problem in Afghanistan. Do we think that we could have encouraged better an internal state building effort?
Maybe, it's hard to say. Certainly I think it could have been done better, but that doesn't guarantee that it's possible. It's very difficult to say. As I say, I think a lot of it comes down to internal politics. There are a lot of factors that make it difficult for Afghanistan to go through state building, say, as opposed to a country like Vietnam, for example. You know, its geography, its demography, however that's pronounced. You know, the economic situation, is just the history of the country, the period of time in which state building was trying to happen. Is state building possible in sort of this hyper globalized world? It's hard to say.
Right,
I
yeah.
mean, maybe an example like Kosovo suggests it is, but maybe examples like Somalia and Afghanistan suggest it's not.
Or that, you know,
I
it requires very specific conditions.
Yes.
Well, I think we should ask, in what ways is the situation in Afghanistan like other countries where state building has been attempted? For this meeting, we did read a paper by Taylor and Batea that compared Afghanistan to Vietnam, which I think is what you're alluding to, Owen, right?
Yes, that is the one.
Yes. And in that paper, it does discuss the way in which war making and war in general degrades the attempts of many third world countries in their attempts to form a state. And I was thinking about this question and the way it's similar to, I guess, the first major example I thought of was the Nigerian Civil War, where, you know, we saw an example of another third world country that struggled with that concept of a nation state being foisted upon it. I think that in Afghanistan especially, you see a big problem, which is that there is no clear ethnic majority. There is a plurality, of course, but there is no majority. And with an identity that is largely associated with the Pashtuns, not necessarily, but largely associated with the Pashtuns, it becomes very alienating for other groups. And it's hard to get people to sign up for a government that you know is going to be against the interest of your group, if you're, for example, Hazara.
Right.
And that's something that people could never resolve on the American end. or they could never get people to say, yeah, well, the Pashtuns are the majority, but just trust us, they'll treat you well.
So
I think that was a really big hurdle for them.
So there's some, like cultural issues like that, or ethnic issues, cultural ethnic issues. I think maybe there's also a different kind of cultural issue, which we also read about, which is that we were trying to build, as Owen described at the beginning, a liberal democracy.
Yes.
And maybe Afghanistan wasn't at the sort of economic development or something to where that could happen. Right.
Yeah, and that goes hand in hand with that too.
Right.
In the sense of, the old Benjamin Franklin quote: "Democracy is two wolves and a sheep deciding what's for dinner."
Right.
And when you have political parties emerging in a lot of third world countries, they're not based on class or economic or religious interests necessarily. They're often based on ethnic issues.
Right.
Right. Just like in Trinidad, right, where my family's from, there are two big parties, and one of them is for the Indians and one of them is for the Creoles. But yeah, liberal democracy. I think that we should be careful the way we discuss this, because I think it's often misconstrued, the way in which it is meant. But we can't introduce it to a country whole cloth and expect it to work under the same circumstances.
It comes to an issue, I suppose, of Eurocentrism. Our understanding of how states are made is very Eurocentric. Most leading theories, the main theory, which was written by a man called Charles Tilly, its entirely basic example is early modern Europe. The creation of states, stuff like the Treaty of Westphalia, which in any class on states is the first thing you learn. It's it's really only based on one example from one period of time in one part of the world. Now, has that model been replicated in some places? Yeah. Places like the USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, which were mainly made up of European settlers. But it has also been replicated elsewhere. Japan is probably the most notable example.
Yeah, there's a handful of countries which we can say have whose statehood isn't inherited from Europe, right?
Yeah. One thing I will say,
it might be borrowed, you could say.
Yeah. Liberal democracy, the emergence of like a modern state, which are fairly closely linked to each other. Obviously not all countries we'd call a modern state are liberal democracies. I don't think anyone would dispute that China is a modern state, but it's not a liberal democracy. But for the most part, all modern states emerged either through liberal democracies or the communist revolutions, essentially. But for the most part, I'd say the key thing is actually economic, in that it's tied to industrialization and urbanization, which allows for the centralization of political power, of coercive power, of revenue collection, which actually allow a modern state to function, essentially. And you just don't really see that in Afghanistan. As I say, it's largely agrarian and rural. It explains why, for the most part, the Afghan government post-2001, its main areas of support were in Afghanistan's cities and not in the largely rural areas in which the Taliban remained influential.
Right. A liberal democracy requires a lot of trust. And when you've got a country where corruption is the status quo, you're not going to have a lot of trust. That may be also why, say, a version of liberal democracy has failed in Russia, right? Because there's so little trust. It was so corrupt, it became so corrupt so quickly that democratic institutions couldn't hold.
And that's why a lot of the opposition to that corrupt system often took an anti-democratic stance with things like National Bolshevism.
Right.
Well, that's another matter.
Or with Islamism in the Taliban, right?
Exactly.
Right.
That is a through line, right. I would say.
They're trying to create an identity for a state. It may be not a nation state as we recognize it. For them, trust, I don't mean necessarily trust in like its simple like trust fall kind of form. I mean a sort of trust in institutions to
good faith institutions.
Be reliable. Right, good faith institutions. I think maybe that's what's so hard to externally impose. right? There are some things we can externally impose. We could externally, and maybe did externally impose on Afghanistan. But yeah, I don't think you can externally impose that. I mean, I think the U.S. can barely internally impose it. I think it's degrading internally, right? So I think most people feel that way. So
I think that Islam in Afghanistan is one of the most powerful trans-ethnic forces in the country. The problem, of course, is that there are a lot of Islamic groups and minorities, namely the Shia Hazara, who might not be protected under an Islamic government and certainly aren't under the Taliban now. But part of me wonders if the U.S. could have encouraged, I know it's dangerous to play with these counterfactuals, but could have encouraged a more Islamic character to or element of the Republic.
Well, I mean,
and play off of that strength.
It's a good question.
Islamic Republic does not have to have this extreme character that we see under the Taliban.
I think it's hard for me to think of a real way to answer this question because it's the U.S.
right
when they
in 2001, the U.S. in 2001.
Right.
I guess it would never happen with that kind of government question.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that so much of the nation state building effort was to legitimize the war, in a sense, and I think
yes, that's a good point.
Imagine the backlash to in America.
It would be unconscionable
trying to build a more Islamic republic.
Right.
Yeah, it would never happen. It couldn't happen.
It would never. It wouldn't, but I think that it is one of the hypothetically most more interesting and not just interesting, but possibly effective routes one could have taken trying to build a stronger, balanced Afghan state.
One of the things I also remember reading was about back in, I want to say the 1920s, maybe into the 1930s, the Afghan government of the time, which was an emirate, tried to bring in Turkish advisors, right? And Turkey, of course, is a country which at that time was experiencing the creation of a sort of democracy and modernization, and Ataturk being strictly secular, right? Having strictly secular beliefs. And it's interesting to think, that those efforts failed. That government failed to secularize Afghanistan. And so that's an interesting point because they tried internally to build a secular government and that failed as well.
It would have to be an Islamic Republican government that allowed or even required representation for all of its religious minorities. Not one that was, like we see under the Taliban, that's just a very crude interpretation of Salafism. But one of the, the Taliban is not using Islam in the way that it could be used most effectively for the good of
sure, a lot of people in Afghanistan don't agree with it.
Well, not only that, they have squandered the opportunity to use an incredibly unifying force, which is Islam, and have imposed an external interpretation of Islam that has more to do with Saudi Salafism and Wahhabism than indigenous, often Sufi interpretations of Islam, using interpretations that even misconstrue Salafism and negate the possible unifying force of Islam. In fact, Islam is more of a unifying force for the members of the Taliban themselves politically than it is for the country.
You're bringing up a point that we haven't discussed here, we haven't discussed before, which is, were there other external factors which caused state building to fail, right? So you're bringing up an interpretation, a non-native interpretation of Islam to Afghanistan.
Yeah.
There's also other things, right? So, we haven't talked about Pakistan, for example, which for decades has been funding violent extremist groups all around the world, but particularly in Afghanistan.
Especially in Afghanistan, with an eye to India.
It
especially.
and it has exactly right. It has one of the most porous borders, and they want to keep. And it's generally, from what I've read, regarded that
it is the most porous border in the country, in the world.
Yeah, and it's generally regarded that Pakistan is in a stronger position with a weak Afghanistan, because of course, Pakistan has Pashtun people within it, and they don't want
In the
a united
northwest border
Afghanistan.
province.
Right, and they don't want a united Afghanistan to start thinking about some sort of ethnic unification. Also, Afghanistan right now, India is trying to build a relationship with Afghanistan, right? With keeping Pakistan in mind, right? To have somebody on the other side of the border, and that's something we haven't really thought about.
I know in the future I'll be happy to get into some of the questions of how Salafist interpretations of Islam have influenced the religious culture of Afghanistan more. But wondering if we could touch again more directly on some of these questions that we outlined before for the episode regarding if state building in Afghanistan was an example of new imperialism. Maybe we could touch on that more directly and get back to the central thread here.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose, would you consider the American invasion, occupation, administration to be an example of imperialism or neo-imperialism, I suppose? Does that, for you, meet the definition?
It's an interesting question, because one thing that we have, the insecurity in one state can lead to security problems in another state, right? And that was the primary justification of the United States' coalition to invade Afghanistan.
Particularly in the context of late 90s, early 2000s, liberal interventionism.
Right.
The Brahimi report in the UN had come out,
Right.
I think, a year earlier, which was very influential on this idea of, like, we can intervene and sort of improve countries, like we can sort of build like liberal democracies all over the world.
We can stop genocides. We can.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Which, understandably, culturally, following on from like things that happened in the former Yugoslavia, in Rwanda, in Somalia, it was sort of a logical conclusion at the time, especially based on successful interventions in places like Kosovo, Bosnia, Liberia, Sierra Leone.
I think in some ways it sounds like, when you look at America's invasion of Afghanistan, it feels like we made the same kind of justifications that like the French and Russians used to invade the Ottomans.
Yeah, we in a sense, I guess
Except now we're defending liberal values.
Right. What I was kind of suggesting is, I don't really think we went into Afghanistan to help Afghanistan. We went into Afghanistan under this idea to secure our own interests. And if going in and invading another country to secure your own interests isn't the definition of imperialism, I don't know what is.
Yeah, right? I think there is a simplified version of imperialism that certainly would easily fall under the category of imperialism, which is the direct economic exploitation of the region. But there are also more broad aspects in
the extent to which they achieved economic exploitation of Afghanistan, though.
Yeah, I don't think
I'm
that
saying,
was super present, but
I'm saying that's not the key element here.
Right.
But I'm actually saying imperialism is about more than just that. It's also about securing the integrity of your own power projection whenever that's threatened or perceived to be threatened, which I think is a big part of what Afghanistan was about for the U.S.
Right, power projection.
Okay, so do we, just to conclude, want to say, just like sort of yes or no, whether we think state building in Afghanistan was ever possible?
I mean, the resounding answer, I think, is yes. I mean, everything we've said today is in support of that.
I would also say yes, personally. I do think it is theoretically possible, but in the context of 2001, I don't think it was possible. So, maybe. I know I just said yes or no, but
I would say with the resources and boundless coffers of the United States, anything is possible. It's simply the will and motivation and interests. They were not there.
Max?
I'm going to say, for the same reasons, that it's not possible. For all the reasons that Armand just said, it's not possible. Because of the boundless coffers, because of the the lack of genuine interest. Not that there weren't plenty of people coming from the West who were genuinely interested in building a state in Afghanistan, right? Not everybody was coming on with bad faith. It's that, at the core, I do want to say, don't blame everybody, but because at the core, there wasn't really an intention of building. And all of that, all those resources, I think, just went in to make more problems for Afghanistan. For the Afghan state, some of those resources were obviously, used to do some good things, but the overabundance of resources led to, worsened corruption, which worsened trust, which meant that it was impossible.
I think that's a good point. I think that the easy money was a bit of an accelerant on corruption.
Well, thank you for listening. This has been Unending History. I hope you've enjoyed. I hope you've wetted your whistle, so to speak. And hopefully we'll see you next time.
Before you go, we want to say thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to check back soon for more. You can continue listening to us where you found this one. We welcome listener feedback, which you can send to us at our email at unendinghistorypodcast@gmail.com. See you next time.